Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie. In 2004, Marilynne Robinson published a wonderful novel entitled Gilead. It won a 2005 Pulitzer Fiction Prize, and the novel engages its readers in questions of class, race, religion, and spirituality. My guest today, Dr. Clark Maddux, is a fan of Robinson's work, perhaps uses her work in his classes, and is going to walk us through some of these issues that are so provocative. Dr. Maddux, Clark, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So a little bit about my guest. Dr. Maddux is director of the Watauga Residential College here at Appalachian State University, and has a long record of scholarly work on Puritanism and early America, and is currently, I think you're working on, as one of a team of editors on some of Cotton Mather's very important work. So you might want to tell us just a little bit about, which also all this makes you eminently qualified to talk about Gilead, right? Because we're going to be talking about Calvinism in a few moments. But tell us a little bit about your very interesting scholarly work, but then also maybe some of our viewers don't know what Watauga Residential College is, so it might be nice to hear what you do in that role as well.
Sure. Well, thank you. I'll start with that. I'm the director of the only residential college that we have on Appalachian State University's campus. What we try to do in a residential college, and kind of at the core of what we do, is this principle belief that you ought to unite and bring together life in the classroom with life outside of the classroom as much as possible. So all of our faculty offices in Watauga are here in the Living Learning Center residence hall. All of our classrooms for Watauga are here. And we try to build relationships both among students and with students as faculty. We teach mostly general education, and that's where I get to exercise some of my passion in Puritan studies sometime. I graduated from Purdue University with a degree in early American studies, my PhD in early American studies in 2001. My dissertation was on Puritan poetics, but fairly early on, I started working in a series of volumes under the mentorship of Rainer Smolinski at Georgia State University, and Jan Steverman, who is now at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. And they have been working, they've been leading the effort. There are about 10 of us on this effort, including Ken Minkham at Yale, Rick Kennedy at Point Loma Nazarene, Ava Wright in Ohio, and we are working to publish Cotton Mather's synoptic commentary on the Bible, the Biblia Americana. I've been responsible for the volume that contains Ezra through the Psalms, which was published in 2014. And I'm working with Rick Kennedy on the Gospel of John and the Acts of the Apostles.
So this is going to be an important work for early American history and Puritan studies in general. So that's looking forward to the publication of that. Yeah. So I'm curious, just to start us off here with Gilead, what captured your attention about this novel? And I'm wondering, do you use it in your classes ever?
I have used it in classes. I have not used it recently in Watauga. I typically teach our sophomore writing class, and in that class I get to kind of participate again in my interest, and I use the focus in that class is on Appalachian religion. But I have used Gilead in previous classes and have used it before. I think what captured me is the beauty of the language. There are not many books that I would describe as perfect. It is one of them. There is not a sour note in that book, or indeed in the 3 other books that are now part of the series.
That's really high praise. And then when you hear the title of the book, immediately comes to my mind is the balm of Gilead, which is a biblical reference, and Gilead is a biblical place name. Do you think that's an important clue about the content of this novel?
I think it is, although Marilyn Robinson, in interviews about the book, she focuses on the references in Judges and Genesis, where Gilead is sort of a transliteration of the Hebrew for hill of testimony, or stones of witness, sort of evoking that kind of rude altar that the biblical patriarchs would erect. But I can never read the book without thinking of that reference to Jeremiah 8. You know, is there a balm in Gilead, or is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there that I mourn and am crushed? And it has that kind of elegiac quality to it, I think.
Yeah. Well, the transliteration, which means the hill of testimony, works well too, because the novel is essentially, I guess one way of understanding it would be as a testimony of its main character to his son. So tell us a little bit about I guess the plot, or
sure,
plot's the right word with this novel. It might not even be the right word, but what the book is, what it's made of, what you would see as some of the important themes there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's so startlingly beautiful about it is that on the surface, it's such a simple work. It is told in the form of a letter of this aging, near-death congregational minister, Reverend John Ames, written to his son. He was a widower, remarried very late in his life, remarried a much younger woman, and they had a child. And the son is never named in Gilead. He is identified in the second novel, Home, by the name of Robert, who is his closest friend, who is a Presbyterian minister. Robert Boughton is the name of that minister. But on the surface, it's just this kind of retrospect of his life. He reviews the life of his grandfather, who had been an abolitionist, a radical abolitionist in Kansas. The town of Gilead, we find out, was established kind of just as a way station on the Underground Railroad. Had never meant to be there, or hadn't been meant to last. It had been built to serve a very specific purpose. His grandfather rode with John Brown, fought in the Civil War, lost an eye in the Civil War, is this towering prophetic figure throughout the book. But then his son, John's father, who also fought in the Civil War, comes back from the horrors of war as a committed pacifist. And so he can never quite reconcile with his own father as John's father wrestles with sort of the experience that he had in the war. And then we learn a little bit later in the novel, and the sort of central figure who is, throughout much of the novel is sort of not present, is John Ames's namesake, who is Robert Boughton's son. So he is John Ames Boughton. He is a ne'er-do-well. He gets a young, impoverished teenage girl pregnant and runs away from home and is absent throughout much of his later adolescence and adult life. And he returns in the novel, and you sort of find out, it's not until the very end that you find out that John Ames Boughton has since married an African-American woman in St. Louis. And in the era of Jim Crow and miscegenation laws, he's trying to find a place where he can be at home with his wife and his son.
Right.
And so it struggles, the whole novel struggles with kind of the mid-century America, with the ethos of mid-century America, with declining faith, with what it means to be faithful, with what the experience of grace is about. And so even though on the surface it's a very placid novel in which almost nothing happens at all, the currents of it run very deeply.
Well, I think one way to read the novel is as a struggle of faith. I mean, I know Reverend Ames is trying to leave a memoir of sorts to his son, but he really does kind of express this struggle with his own faith, and it plays off of the three generations of ministers: his grandfather, his father, and then, of course, his own ministry. But I wanted to pick up on, you mentioned the John Ames Bowden, Jack, right? As he was known in the novel. It seems to me that his return into this story in some ways plays off the biblical theme of the prodigal son. Is that the way you're reading that relationship there? And how would you go about talking about the episodes with Jack? And
yeah, absolutely. I think that question of who sons are in relation to their fathers, and of course the son who leaves and then comes back is certainly a recurrent theme, a recurrent motif throughout the book. At one point, the Reverend John Ames makes the point that the father in the parable of the prodigal son never asks for his son to repent or forgive him. He just embraces him. He brings him back into the fold. And the son himself doesn't really have to struggle with that repentance, that he's accepted, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so that is very much part of the scene in it. There's a marvelous quote from Augustine toward the end of the novel, as the Reverend Ames is sort of wrestling with a lot of this toward the end of the novel. And I'm going to paraphrase it, but he quotes Augustine, and he said that God loves each of us as if we were an only child.
Yeah, that's a wonderful quote. I mean, it really is. And I think it does kind of reinforce this hopeful ending, or graceful ending is maybe a better way of saying that, because I get the sense that the Reverend Ames and perhaps the reader wants some sort of judgment rendered against Jack, but what happens rather than judgment is grace and forgiveness and bringing back into the fold.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the real challenges of the book. In fact, I mean, many of the critical reviews of it that I've read, at the very end of the book, and this is sort of a motif, it's a repeated phrase in the book where Reverend Ames says, I'll pray and then I'll sleep. And those words are the coda to the entire novel. And of course, those are the words that King Lear uses in Act 3, Scene 4, I think it is, when just before, in the depth of his madness, he's huddled in a little tent, and his fool, who has stayed with him throughout the tribulation, he sends his fool into the tent. He says, go to sleep. And he says, I'll pray and then I'll sleep. And what some critics make of the book, and this is, again, kind of where I probably diverge, and when I teach it, I might teach it differently than others. But there's a tendency, I think, in retrospect, for us to judge Reverend Ames harshly. And, from our standards, we want to say that he should have been more like his radical grandfather, right? He should have embraced Jack and embraced the family, the interracial family that he wanted to bring there. And he doesn't offer that. He does offer grace. He does offer blessing. But I think one of the things that makes the book so difficult and so challenging is we kind of want to judge him for that. And I can never look at Reverend Ames except with mercy, and something like pity that then turns on myself.
No, that's a crucial phrase there, that turns on yourself. That's interesting. So one of the things that, well, in this story, the Reverend Ames is third generation Congregationalist minister. Here in the South in the 21st century, we don't hear about Congregationalist churches much. So it might help just a little bit to for you as the expert on early America
Sure.
to tell us what a Congregationalist church is.
Sure. Well, of course, the early colonists in the New England colonies, most of them, not exclusively, but most of them identified as Puritans. And for them, that meant that they wanted to purify the Church of England. So they always saw themselves as communing and faithful members of the National Church of England. The difference was that they argued against a kind of episcopacy, against a bishopric system of government of churches. And so for them, it was important that each church be independent, and that church be comprised of what they called a visible community of saints. And so, of course, after the Revolution, and after what the Revolution made of a sort of definitive break with the National Church of England, those Puritan churches became known as Congregationalist. And what's important there is, of course, the idea in church polity that each congregation is its own body of rulers, that they rule each other, and that there is no kind of overarching system of oversight of those churches. Most of the old Puritan churches in New England are now congregational. They do sort of spread across the old Northwest, across Ohio and Indiana and into Iowa, and they're certainly still there in the upper Midwest. Yeah.
So the term really refers to the polity of the church, but theologically, Congregationalists are Calvinists by heritage. Is that correct?
That is correct. Again, insofar as there is a kind of historical genealogy that you trace between Congregationalists and Puritans, and the Puritans were by and large intensely Calvinistic. Most congregational churches remain at least expressly Calvinistic, kind of how the extent to which they practice that may be. I suppose if you're Dutch Reformed or Christian Reformed, you might question it, but most of them continue to espouse some version of Calvinism, right?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that in this book that part of what Robinson is doing is engaging Calvinism, and I kind of see it as blunting the hard edges a little bit, or maybe trying to reframe some of the popular conceptions, or we might even say misconceptions about Calvinism. Is that part of what you see going on in this story?
I think so, and I think I know beyond any shadow of a doubt, it's one of the things that drew me to the book. That, one of the things that I learned early on in my study of Puritanism is that these are not the stereotypes that kind of get passed down through history. They're not rigid, self-righteous, self-assured, judgmental people. In fact, it's quite the reverse. There's what appears to be an accurate story about John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Boston colony. One time when an old widow woman was stealing his wood, which would have been, a capital offense, she was stealing his wood, and his neighbor comes to him and says, this old woman's stealing your firewood. And John Winthrop's answer is to take a bunch of his firewood over to her little hovel and say, I notice that you need firewood. Here's some. And whenever you need more, I want you to feel free to come get whatever you need. And he goes back to his neighbor and says, well, I guess I cured her of stealing, right? These are people who love their children. Cotton Mather's idea of punishing his children was not to whip them or abuse them. His idea of punishing his children was not to let them participate in evening prayers with him.
Right. Yeah.
So I do think that the book as a whole, and Robinson certainly as a writer, asks us to rethink our own judgments about Calvinism, that it is about, at its center, at its living core, is the mystery of grace, and the fact that we don't deserve that. And I think it's one of the things that she communicates so well.
I think it's one of the things she communicates so well as well. I would agree. And one of the things that struck me earlier when you quoted Augustine about God loving each of his children as if they were an only child. So there's this kind of sense in the book that human nature should be understood in terms of the image of God. And oftentimes with Calvinism, you get this kind of heavy dose of total depravity, that human beings are totally depraved and sinful. So this is kind of a beautiful way of reframing that notion about what it means to be human.
Yeah, one of the interesting relationships in the novel itself, and again, we haven't talked much about it, but the Reverend Ames's young wife, Lila, who has her own book that's devoted to her, the third in the series, she has lived a certain, what many people might call a dubious life. She is of questionable morality and reputation. And again, it would be easy in the book to kind of, if you sort of take that standard Calvinist line, to look down upon her, to judge her. And Ames, at one point, when he's writing about his wife, his son's mother, he says something to the effect of, I believe there's something like an earned innocence. And I cannot but look at your mother and think, this is a woman who would have traveled with our Savior. That there's a kind of, that part of the mystery of grace is that remaking of us that goes on, which again is at the core of what Calvinism thinks.
Right. And so it's not only about God's grace toward his human creation, but it's also about the human ability to demonstrate grace toward the people around us, the people we're in relationship with. And that too kind of brings in a notion of human agency that is not normally thought of when we think of Calvinism, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that throughout all of the novels, it's one of the things that Ames and the characters in all of the series sort of wrestle with. Jack himself, the last novel is devoted to Jack. I haven't read it yet, but I look forward to it. But in the other novels, he thinks of himself as irredeemable and somehow beyond the touch of grace. And again, I think, what Ames wants to remind us of in Gilead is that on the one hand, we are all well beyond the touch of grace. On the other hand, none of us are.
Right.
And I think it's that paradox and that mystery that is sort of at the center of it.
Yeah. Well, we're about out of time, but I wanted to touch on one other thing. In the beginning, you described this novel almost as the perfect novel based on the beauty of the prose. And many of the most beautiful passages to me engage the metaphor of light in some way. Mm-hmm. I think about the point when the Reverend Ames and his father visit the grave of the grandfather, for example, and we get this marvelous description of the moon and the sun and the juxtaposed light. What do you think of that? Is that something that's a kind of central thread throughout the novel? This play with the concept of light and love and
Yes. Oh, absolutely. You get scenes of the light through the church windows. There's another just absolutely beautiful scene where the Reverend Ames is walking into his empty church, and the way the light sort of is coming through those high arched windows, typical of a 19th century wooden church. Um, and the penetration of it and diffusion and pervasion of it is, I think, again, it stands in as a kind of metaphor for grace and God's love.
Yeah.
The way in which it reaches out to us and reaches us even when we're not prepared for it.
Yeah, and that's so. Those are beautiful passages, and I think it also, once again, we have a tendency to think of Calvinism and Puritanism as a kind of dark theology and a heavy theology, and here we get all these images of light and lightness and so forth, which again engages Calvinism at a certain level here.
Yeah, I agree. I do agree with that. Yeah.
Well, it is a beautiful book. I'm going to have to read the rest of them with you, and we can continue this dialogue. There's so much here that we haven't had a chance to talk about. But I think that what you have expressed so eloquently here is that this book engages us around the themes of spirituality and religion. And one thing I wanted to talk about and didn't get to is kind of using the Reverend Ames as a model for our own self-critical evaluation of what we believe and how we believe and so forth. There's so much here.
Yeah.
And I thank you for joining us today, Clark.
Thank you for having me. I would be delighted to talk about the others when you want.
We absolutely will do that. If not on camera, then in the hallway at work.
Certainly.
Well, that's it for today for Religion and Life. I thank Dr. Clark Maddux for joining us with his insightful view on the novel Gilead. I hope you will join us next week as we continue to explore the intersections of religion, society, and culture. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwald.